We're very pleased to be hosting Ann Kim, who's here to talk about her new book, Poverty for Profit: How Corporations Get Rich Off of America's Poor. Now, two things to know about Ann to start with. She has a law degree, and she has a journalism degree. And knowing the law and knowing how to write have enabled her to pursue her interest in researching and reporting on public policy, blending policy analysis with investigative journalism and narrative. She's been a corporate lawyer, a congressional staff member, and a senior staff person at two Washington, D.C. think tanks. She's also written for the Washington Monthly, where she's a contributing editor. Her previous book, Abandoned, focused on the growing population of disconnected youth in America. Her new book's an even broader and a more penetrating look at another major social policy challenge, namely poverty. She explores the private contractors in the poverty business, the firms that, since Ronald Reagan's push to privatize government, have come to deliver many of the social services received by poor Americans. And what Ann extensively documents and describes is how lots of money intended to help the least well-off has ended up instead benefiting private firms, often through overpricing, under-delivering, and other predatory, if not outright fraudulent activity. So if you've ever wondered why, given all that the United States has spent over the years, poverty remains stubbornly persistent, this costly exploitative diversion of dollars is at least part of the explanation, along with, of course, structural barriers and generally inadequate investment. Federal and state anti-poverty programs, simply put, have been a lot less efficient than they could be, and contends there just hasn't been enough oversight and accountability for what's happening with the dollars going into these programs, so merely providing more money, and argues, wouldn't be enough to fix what's gone wrong. We need greater accountability and efficiency, better governance, Ann says, for anti-poverty spending to work more effectively. Now, it's really a very compelling argument put forward by Ann with detailed examples and a very lucid narrative. Her book is organized into chapters that span the various services provided to low-income Americans. Reading about all this, as one reviewer put it, is both sobering and infuriating. So there's really quite a lot to discuss this evening. And helping the discussion along will be Paul Glastris, who for more than 2 decades has been the editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly. Now, multiple sections of Ann's book started out as articles in Paul's magazine, and Paul is thanked in the acknowledgments for teaching Ann how to meld policy analysis with narrative. So he's done a really good job. Paul also has co-authored 2 books himself, The Other College Guide and Elephant in the Room, which is an ebook about Washington during the administration of George W. Bush. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ann Kim and Paul Glastris.
Well, Brad, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction and for opening the bookstore for Ann. I am not going to pretend, Ann, that this is going to be an adversarial interview, given that I basically agree with everything, and we've been kind of co-working on it a little bit for a number of years. But I'll try to put myself in the position of a skeptical reader just to draw out some of the obvious questions that one might have about your thesis, which, I think, Brad, you were correct. I haven't seen a book that opened up a new way of looking at government so profoundly as Anne has done in this book. And you think everything's been written, and she suddenly realizes she's discovered a continent you didn't know was there. And it is very, very well written, very fair-minded. It is not a screed against capitalism. It is not a screed against the corporate world. But it is devastating in its portrayal of what's happened in the process of privatizing our social welfare programs. So I want to ask Anne, you open the book up with a tour for the reader of a place called Capitol Heights. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C., where the businesses aren't the same as what you'd find in your typical middle class or affluent suburb. Tell us a little bit about what you show, what it looks like down and if you just go down Pennsylvania Avenue outside of the city, that's where it is, and what the businesses are and how they relate to the thesis of your book.
Yeah, so thank you, Paul, and thank you, Brad. And thank all of you for being here. I'm really glad that the storms ended in time for you all to be here. So the neighborhood that Paul is referring to is called District Heights, and it's PG County right over the river as you drive down Pennsylvania Avenue. And there is a giant shopping center at the corner of Silver Hill Road and Pennsylvania Avenue called Penn Station. It is nothing like Tyson's Corner. So right at that corner, you will see a giant dialysis center next to a 24-hour liquor store. There are any number of tax preparation outlets that are there, a discount furniture store. Surrounding it are apartments that are run by Section 8 landlords. So it is very much an emblematic of how the safety net has been privatized and about the amounts of money that can be made from poverty. And that is kind of the central irony of this book. Like, there's a huge amount of money that can be made from poverty, from government programs for the poor, and from poor people themselves. And as Brad mentioned, I go into chapters in the book about the different kind of mini industries in each chapter, but I think there's kind of three ways to think about who these profiteers are. And kind of the first category are, you can think of them as skimmers. These are the tax prep industry folks who charge people to file tax returns and then charge predatory products to get the return quickly. There's a second category that I think of as kind of monopolist contractors, and we can go into a little bit more detail about who those people are and how much they charge for what they do. Just to give you a taste, they run Medicaid programs in half the states around the country, making very good money off of that model. And then there's kind of a third group of profiteers that I think of as kind of opportunists. And these are bail bondsmen, these are dialysis centers, like the ones in District Heights, who are there because they rely predominantly on a low-income and minority clientele. And the reason for that is because kidney disease and kidney failure disproportionately impacts communities because of decades of disparities and failures, frankly, in public policy governance.
Well, that's an interesting formulation or an interesting way of categorizing this industry or these industries. Let's kind of take them one by one.
Okay.
You did a lot of traveling for this book and had a lot of, even though it was during COVID, you managed to get into a lot of these organizations. One that really struck me was a place in Rogers, Arkansas, called Rogers Car Mart. Tell us about your experience at Rogers Car Mart.
Yeah, so I should call these guys up. So this is kind of a typical kind of what I consider the skimmers, right? So Rogers Car Mart is what's called a buy here, pay here car dealership. They finance it there with pretty high interest rates, used car loans for people who don't have much credit. What they'll also do for you is they'll do your taxes. So when I gave them a call, they offered to do my taxes, and they would charge me a couple $100 for that, including a printing fee, a processing fee. All of that would have added up to about 15% of what the typical person pays for or gets in a refund that year. Then they offered to sell me a car, and they have a huge inventory. So the idea would be that whatever's left of my refund, I could just give them as a down payment. And so you got to admire this kind of entrepreneurship, right? Because their clientele probably doesn't have a lot of cash in hand for a down payment. So what they do is they partner with an outfit called TaxMax that provides the software for the tax preparation so they can grab the entirety of that refund. So TaxMax also works with mobile home dealerships. They work with check cashers. They work with pawn shops. The Government Accountability Office actually did kind of a little survey of all the different businesses that work in this way. They found a place that'll offer you a free pair of shoes if you come in and do your tax prep with them, discounts on rent-to-own furniture, a discount on your pawn rates if you're pawning there. So the variations go on.
It's like a superstore for...
Oh, yeah. Well, we're talking about $57 billion in tax refunds that are available.
And so people understand, it's not just tax refunds, it's a particular part of the tax code called the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC. Explain to folks what that is and how these companies grew around that.
Sure. So yes, they are targeting a particular tax credit for working families, the EITC, which returned about $57 billion, like I said, in 2022, including about $109 million for people right here in the DC area. And it is a tax credit for low-income working families. And that's where the complexity comes in, because in order to qualify for the tax credit, you have to prove that you worked a certain number of hours, and then you have qualifying children. And so if you are a low-income person who's terrified of the IRS knocking on your door, you want to have a professional, or someone you think is a professional, doing your taxes for you. And that's where the storefront tax preparers come in. That's where Liberty Tax comes in. That's where Jackson Hewitt comes in, some of these chains you've heard of. And they will charge hundreds of dollars. And by the way, the tax preparation industry is not regulated. You don't have to pass a test to be a tax preparer. You could literally buy TurboTax and set up a shop yourself and charge people hundreds of dollars to do their taxes.
And if the tax prep firm screws up your taxes, and it's very complicated,
liable, right.
They're not liable, you're liable, right?
Correct.
Correct. And the AITC is, I think you say in your book, is a very successful anti-poverty program, probably the biggest chunk of cash working families get over the course of the year. And yet it's been whittled away over the years by the need for these folks to have help filling it out. And the complexity of it is driven by what?
By the politics of poverty. We have decided as a country that benefits that we give to poor people are conditioned upon something. Like you have to be deserving in some way. So that means you have to be working, or it has to come in the form of a voucher, which is what food stamps are, or a Section 8 voucher, because we, as taxpayers, want to know that the money is going to housing or it's going to food, because we don't quite trust low-income Americans to spend cash. And so that creates complexity, and that does create these little interstices for these companies to come in and create opportunities. That's why you have Section 8 landlords and management companies that specialize only in Section 8 properties.
The next category, I can't remember what you called it, but
contractors.
Would dialysis fit into that?
Those, I would kind of put them in both the contractor and the opportunist category.
Because there's a company that you, again, kind of had experience in that is, I think, they have, the Cool Smiles was the name of the firm. I think they may have changed their name. Tell us about dialysis. Tell us about Cool Smiles and what you found. Yeah,
those are the dentist guys. So a lot of Medicaid has been privatized, both in its administration, but also, of course, obviously in the provision of services. And one area where a lot of really damaging impacts have happened has been in Medicaid dentistry. So it's really only children that qualify for Medicaid benefits for routine dental care, and adults only have access to Medicaid for emergency care. But the rates that Medicaid pays are rock bottom low. And for a variety of reasons, kind of mainstream dentists don't want to treat Medicaid patients. So what's happened is that kind of a subset of dentists and dental practices, primarily owned by private equity firms, have come in to kind of corner the Medicaid dentistry market. And because of the low payment rates, what it is a volume business. Now, Cool Smiles, they have changed their name because I'll talk about this in just a second, why. When I was working at a think tank, they offered a chance for me to come out and see how well they are, working with low-income children. When I got to the office, and they took me back to their treatment room, there were 5 beds arranged kind of like spokes in a wheel. And it dawned on me then that this is like a factory. I mean, they have 5 children, heads all touching. They would work on at a time. And a couple years after that visit, the company that was involved in this was hit with a Medicaid fraud prosecution, which they settled for $24 million. They're still in business, but they've changed their name from Cool Smiles to Pine Hill Dentistry. The office is still there. I looked it up the other day. So this kind of like Medicaid dentistry, these chains have popped up all over the country, and wherever they've gone, there have been like Medicaid prosecutions that have followed. So in one instance in North Carolina, there was a dentist who was fined $10 million by the federal government because he had performed 17 root canals on a 3-year-old. And 17 caps on the same child. In Colorado, they had to ban the use of what are called papoose boards. It's literally a board with Velcro straps to restrain the child, because what they were doing was over-treating children and then charging Medicaid for it. But the only way they could perform multiple procedures on a child is to restrain them. And so Colorado ended up banning these papoose boards because of the abuses that were arising from these Medicaid dental chains that actually began in Colorado and proliferated everywhere.
Yeah, there's some, I think in polite company, we won't go into some of the details that are in the book about just how horrific these, the insides of some of these companies are. But read the book. It is pretty terrifying. And sort of endless litigation and attempts to overcome this. I'm going to draw another example. The government is deeply involved in funding training for people who've lost their jobs. And you write in your book about a college or a training organization in East LA called International College. I want to lay out some examples for the folks, or have you do that, so we know what we're talking about. Tell us about that world and that college.
Yeah, so, I mean, the federal government has spent billions over the years investing in job training programs, and not a lot of them have worked. I'm not sure that really any of them have worked. I mean, starting with CETA in the 1970s, and even before that, Job Corps, we'll talk about that in the 1960s. The primary workforce training program is called WIOA, the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. And if you're an unemployed or underemployed person, you can get a voucher, a training voucher, to go to an approved provider who will take your money and train you to become something. In the case of this college in East LA, you can train online to decorate cakes. It's like a $6,000 course online to decorate cakes. And literally nobody got a job from this. And there were like 3 students. Yet the state of California had approved them to accept federal money to train people to better themselves.
Right. And the state gives the federal government gives the state money that then the money can go via the recipient to a college, and the college is supposed to provide data on whether it works.
And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It's not necessarily a college, because there are a lot of fly-by-night providers. Again, like even in the state
College
of
in
Maryland,
quotes, yeah.
College in quotes. You can apply to be an eligible training provider, is what it's called, and get on the eligible training provider list. There's an application, and if you say that you're providing something, you can probably get approval. You could run a journalism school out of Washington Monthly and get federal money. I mean, it's pretty lax.
I'm going to put that in the back of my head. This trend, this privatizing of social welfare programs, it's not brand new, but it's not been forever. Tell us about the history of this.
Yeah, so this is a 40-year train that we've been riding, and it began with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And back then, there was kind of mythology around business, right? There were these CEOs that everybody idolized, including, God help us, Donald Trump, but also Lee Iacocca and
Jack Welch and
exactly. So there was this mythos around business and how business could do things better, faster, cheaper. So why not do that with government? And around the same time, people were beginning to experiment in cities and states with privatizing, say, garbage collection, and that seemed to work okay. So Ronald Reagan, and it's always been a political win to bash big government, and Ronald Reagan really elevated that to an art, especially when he said that government is not the problem, not the solution, government is the problem. And so in 1984 and 1988, he had two commissions that looked at waste, fraud, and abuse, and then at privatization. And the 1988 commission is the one that came out with recommendations to privatize everything from prisons to Medicare to air traffic control. And if you look at the news, there's a lot of that has happened or is happening or is part of agendas to happen in the future. It's kind of this 40-year-long quest to really hollow out government and replace it with the private sector. And that happened, it actually accelerated, unfortunately, with Bill Clinton in 1996, because for political reasons, he felt that he needed to adopt kind of this reinventing government, better government ethos. And part of what happened with the 1996 welfare reform, which took the old aid to families with dependent children and turned it into a temporary assistance for needy families with time limits and work requirements and all of that, he also, it also became a block grant. So the money was coming not from the federal government to the beneficiary, which was the old program, but from the federal government to the states. And with that, he removed the prohibition on states allowing private companies to make determinations about whether you're eligible for benefits, how much you get, and whether you're entitled to keep them. And so that opened the floodgates for privatization. So within, just an example, within a month of Clinton signing the welfare reform law, there was a three-way bidding war in Texas to run the $586 million welfare system. That was the size of the contract. And the three companies that were bidding were Lockheed Martin, Anderson Consulting, and Ross Perot's Electronic Data Systems. So, and there's this other company now that kind of has a monopoly on a lot of this. Their revenues quintupled from like $80 million to almost $500 million from 1995 to 2001. That company, by the way, is located in Tyson's Corner. It's called Maximus, and their offices are beautiful.
As a former member of the Clinton administration, I will also point out that that was Newt Gingrich's law that he signed. It
was, right.
And he also doubled the EITC and did a lot of stuff that provided more social welfare benefits, but he did sign the law. So we've hit at least two of the three categories that you laid out. Let's talk about the monopolists. And one example, I think, a key example in your book is Job Corps. Now, those of us of a certain age remember Job Corps. You have to be my age, really, to remember that Job Corps was a big, Great Society program that was launched to great fanfare. It was going to take young people from very unpromising backgrounds and in residential centers train them for the world of work. And tell us about Job Corps and what's happened to it.
Yeah, so Job Corps was actually part of the original war on poverty. It was founded by Sergeant Shriver. And as Paul said, the idea was to take people out of these difficult environments, put them into a much more constructive environment, teach them skills, and then turn them into productive citizens. So this residential model really doesn't actually work very well today because a lot of these centers are out in rural parts of America and there really isn't any reason to be out there. But it still exists. It's like a $1.7 billion program. It is actually the largest program for young adults between 16 and 25 who need some sort of training and job training and education. It's been run by the same handful of contractors basically since 1964. In fact, one of the Job Corps contracts, it's been privatized from day one, But one of the Job Corps contractors, in fact, says on their website, we were one of the original Job Corps contractors. Job Corps, unfortunately, has been under multiple audits, investigations. There have been murders on campuses. There's a 2018 Inspector General audit that found that the work outcomes are negative, basically. What they were doing, kids would go back to the same job they had before they entered Job Corps. Job Corps would consider that a success because the person was unemployed, but clearly they had not advanced in any particular way. So there was cheating. I mean, just a terrifically ineffective program. Yet this program continues to survive. And it's testament to kind of the power of these monopolists to kind of hang on to these contracts. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is, like I mentioned, a lot of these programs, the centers are based in rural areas. Rural areas equals jobs. And they have very tight relationships with the Congress people who represent these districts. And when the Trump administration, of all people, tried to shut down a few of the Job Corps centers, that effort lasted literally 2 weeks. There was such an outcry from the Congress people whose centers were in the crosshairs, and from every Job Corps graduate that they managed to round up, that effort quickly died. And the second part of it, too, is that it's on progressives to some extent because nobody wants to criticize the program because the inevitable response will be it might be cut. So it's better to have the $1.7 billion going to an ineffective program that helps some people rather than risk having the program cut altogether. And that's another kind of commentary on where we are with our politics, that even Democrats can't really advocate for effective government anymore because the political risks are high from doing so.
And, in theory, the idea that the private sector ought to be able to deliver social services more effectively, efficiently than a government bureaucracy doesn't sound crazy.
No.
Why is that not the case? Or is it the case sometimes?
Well, when we're talking about garbage collection, sure. The stakes are pretty low, but it doesn't really work in social services for a couple of reasons. First is that there's no real market on the seller side. The reason that the Job Corps contractors have managed to hang on for so long is that those guys are the only ones who know how to run Job Corps contracts at this point. They've done this for 40 years. So how is anyone going to start up a company that's going to challenge these big contractors who get tens of millions of dollars to run these centers over decades? The second part of it is that the reason why it doesn't work is that the incentives don't quite align, right? What matters to a profit-making concern is not going to get you poverty reduction, which takes huge amounts of investment over many, many years. And a lot of times the outcomes are not measurable in dollars and cents in a way that makes sense for a for-profit company. There have been experiments of social impact bonds, that kind of thing. There was a very famous one a few years back in Salt Lake County where Goldman Sachs told Salt Lake County that they would invest in preschool for kids, and they would get their money back from the money saved if the children didn't end up in special education. So a few years later, they called it a success. Goldman Sachs, got back like $250,000. And then immediately, there was a lot of criticism for a couple of reasons. They had tracked the wrong thing. They had assumed that every kid who was getting preschool funded by Goldman Sachs would have been in special education. So they were getting paid for children who may never have needed special education at all. So they were measuring the wrong thing. And then secondly, it turned out that Goldman was only investing about $1,700 per child in preschool. And all of the evaluators say, you can't have a quality preschool program for that little money. There's something else going on that Goldman probably should not have been paid for. So it's very, very difficult, as much as people want to do the doing well by doing good, it's very difficult to create a program that is effective and aligns the incentives in the right way and actually creates a marketplace with genuine competition that enables these efficiencies to occur. It just doesn't happen in social services very well.
Let's go back to Medicaid. So the problem with Medicaid, as you describe in the book, and these sort of, let's say, the dental care for children is that the cost, the rate that the doctors get paid is very low, and most dentists aren't willing to do that work for that price. Why isn't the solution just raise the rate?
Yeah, they actually tried that, I think, in one state, Connecticut, I think. I do mention that. And all that happened was that the Medicaid dentists got more money, and these did just as many procedures as before. And it's the problem is deeper than that. Maybe higher rates might tempt some dentists to take some Medicaid patients, but there's a broader problem within a dental profession where they're just not trained patients. And it's, I think, a much deeper conversation than what we can have here. Part of it is dental school debt. If you're facing $1 million from dental school, Medicaid patients aren't going to help you pay that down. There are a lot of incentives that pull you away from treating the patients who most need help. I think one solution could be community health centers that offer dental health. But then again, community health centers aren't terribly well funded, and they're not in very many places. So that's only a partial solution to this.
Before 40 years ago, some of these programs didn't exist, but they were presumably delivered more through direct government. And one example would be housing. We had in this country, we built a lot of public housing from the 1920s through the 1960s. And as a journalist, I was in a lot of that housing, and some of it was okay. The retiree housing is usually pretty good, but a lot of it was just awful.
Yeah.
So Section 8 comes along, and again, I believe it started under Nixon, but it was Clinton who really grew it. And the idea was give somebody a voucher to get a private apartment. Mm-hmm. I've been to Section 8 housing too, and it is better, at least the places that I've seen, and it's been some years, than what I saw in the housing projects.
Yeah.
And yet it hasn't reached its potential. It hasn't, you say, delivered on its promise. Explain what it hasn't done and why.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a variation of the same problem with dentists. When you don't have the dentists who don't want Medicaid patients, you have a lot of landlords who don't want Section 8 tenants. And so the idea behind Section 8 was to break up concentrated poverty by having tenants have the choice to move out of a bad neighborhood and into a good one, presumably with better schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But because not enough landlords are accepting Section 8, you end up with concentrated poverty again.
And by the way, when that happened, there's a lot of literature saying it does work.
Right. If you can do it.
Yeah. Rates of crime go down, education, jobs, income of the young people who grew up in the better neighborhoods in Section 8. It really works.
Right. So there's a very famous experiment called Moving to Opportunity, where they gave people vouchers to move to low poverty neighborhoods, and that's exactly what happened. The neighborhood effects were very strong on the children who had the opportunity to do this. But when you're relying on the market again, so landlords have to be willing to accept Section 8. And so how many Section 8 housing places are around here? Probably not. Or in McLean? Probably not. And so you have a market problem once again. And what's happened is that you have industries, private equity again, with real estate management companies that have a whole entire Section 8 portfolios. You have people on YouTube channels giving advice on how you can make a lot of money from Section 8, because the reality is you can. You have a steady stream because the government pays you, the landlord, directly. It's not going to the tenant. There's a wait list of people who want your property. The standards are actually fairly low, even though there are inspections. There's one guy I found named Peter Harris, who has like an entire YouTube channel devoted to like how to get rich off of Section 8 and low rent commercial properties. And his advice includes stuff like, don't have garbage disposals, don't have screen doors, don't bother with this, that, and the other, because Section 8 doesn't require it. You don't want to repair it, you don't need it. And so that kind of tells you the quality that you're likely to find, even though it's better than Cabrini Green, granted. But still, they're not going to be in the neighborhoods that you want to be in to get the kind of effects we're talking about. And that's the betterment of the tenants is not necessarily why the landlords are in business.
You work for the Washington Monthly. You write for the Washington Monthly. Anybody who knows the Washington Monthly knows we never talk about just problems. We always talk about solutions. You've mentioned a couple, but one of the solutions that I read about in your book, these are hard problems to solve, right? And I guess what I came away with your book is not that the private sector has in every case done worse than the public sector, but that in many cases, in most cases, it hadn't done any better. And at the price of draining a lot of money into the hands of people who don't need it. And these are really hard problems to solve, and simple privatization or treating these as markets, as powerful as markets can be, is clearly not the answer. We've had 40 years. What are the answers? And I'm gonna kind of begin with one that's in your book that I think really is an answer, and that is for the EITC. You said that the problem with the EITC is that Congress has made it more and more complex, and the average person is scared to death and probably incapable of filling out their return in a way that's not going to get them audited, or if they get audited, get them in trouble. One way to solve the problem is to make the tax code less complex.
Yeah.
That's really hard. Mm-hmm. But there's another simpler solution, and that is for the IRS, which has all the information on most people who don't have complicated financial lives, to fill out the form for you and mail it to you, and all you do is sign it. Mm-hmm. Why hasn't it actually has begun? We're going to talk about that, but yeah. Why? People have known this for years.
Yep.
Why hasn't that happened?
Yeah, so peculiarity of this whole complex of industries that I think of as Poverty Inc., they spend a lot of time and treasure maintaining the status quo. And that includes maintaining complexity in the case of the tax code. The tax prep companies and the big ones, we're talking about Intuit, H&R Block, those guys, have invested millions of dollars to keep things exactly as they are. They've introduced legislation that would prevent the IRS from being able to provide free file services. They've lobbied against simplicity. They've very much lobbied against this idea of having the government do your taxes for you, arguing that, they can do a better job than government. And that's true in all other industries too, like Job Corps lobbies, using government money, by the way, to do the lobbying. Prison companies, private prisons companies lobby with, and that I think has been like a major contributor to the persistence of all these problems we're talking about. And I think more transparency around the efforts of some of these industries to keep the market captured in this way was one solution.
Yeah, no, you, in your book you talk about we don't have insight into these businesses, in part because a lot of them are no longer publicly traded companies. They're private equity and they don't have to report anything.
Yeah, that's true. So one of the big tax prep firms, Jackson Hewitt, is actually owned by a private equity firm called Corsair Capital. And I think a Corsair is a pirate ship, so it's actually pretty appropriate. But the last public documentation that they filed before they got bought was like in 2019. So we have no idea how much money are they making, how much profit, how many returns are they processing, how much are they charging for the advanced refund products that take up 20% of somebody's refund check. So, and this is public dollars that they're taking. And I think there's a real problem with the Securities Act of 1933 and the Exchange Act of 1934 that just hasn't kept up with where the private equity market has become today. And I'm not the one to figure out what the right regulatory solution is for that, but if you're a chain that's accepting public dollars, like the dentists, the Medicaid dentists are, then your operations should be public if you are making all of your money from public funds. Yet, currently, because of our current regulatory structure with private equity, it's all a black box. We have no idea what's going on.
So transparency is one of the pillars of your vision for solution. Another is more government, more governance.
More governance.
And here's why I'll pick up on the EITC. This year, the Biden administration rolled out a program where the government will do your taxes for you, mail you the return, you sign it, you get it back. Is that a solution?
For this particular problem, yes, I think so. Unfortunately, only about 140,000 households were able to take advantage of this program this year. They've released it to all 50 states, but it's going to be a long time before it becomes kind of a default option. And for people who do have complicated taxes, it probably never will be an option. But yes, but by more governance, we're not talking about, having public sector workers do absolutely everything again. But there are a few things that I think that the government should claw back. And one of them is the ability to determine, are you entitled to benefits? Do you have access to life-saving care? Like, if you are a Medicaid patient, whether you get treatment or not, why is that in the hands of Maximus, this random company out in Tyson's Corner, which runs 1-800-Medicare, by the way? So if you call 1-800-Medicare, you're not actually talking to a Medicare employee. You're talking to a Maximus employee at a call center. Those kinds of things to where life and death is on the line, I think really should be in the hands of a public sector worker that is mission-driven, perhaps in a way that, and not profit-driven in the way that some of these companies are. And so that's part of governance. And then another part of it, of course, is contract oversight. Part of what's happened over 40 years is that the shadow government of contractors far outnumbers the number of actual government workers. And there's a professor at NYU, Paul Light, who's done just a fabulous analysis of the size of the shadow government. In HHS, Health and Human Services, the number of contractors outnumbers federal workers 36-1. So that tells you, can you really manage a contract properly with those kinds of ratios?
Yeah, there's a factoid in your book that I wrote down. A state Medicaid supervisor makes about half as much as a Medicaid HMO supervisor. They work longer hours, are way more accountable. The work is way harder, and the average length of time that person stays in the job is 2 years. So when the government is at such a disadvantage, of course they're getting taken advantage of by contractors.
Yeah.
I see from the clock on the wall, Brad, that we've got 15 minutes. I want to give folks a chance to ask questions. If you have a question, we invite you up to the microphone right here, and I hope you will, because there's a lot more in the book and a lot we didn't get to. But tell us your name and your question.
My name is Caroline Poplin. I'm your age. I remember all those things from the Great Society. You also failed to mention Reagan. It's all about privatization, but there's also the attitude towards poor people, welfare Cadillac. I hope you have that in your book. Having watched all this, I wonder if, and being a physician now and watching managed care, managed competition, Medicaid, of course, is a state program, so there's a limit to what the feds can do. And in fact, the feds used to do more. And when it became a block grant, that was the end of that. And we're not going to have any regulation anymore after January. The Supreme Court has told us that. But perhaps one solution, certainly a solution for medicine, is nonprofit. That these companies are not allowed, should not be allowed to be for profit. And they say, well, there's no difference, but there's a big difference because a nonprofit has to keep the money in the system, whereas a for-profit company is designed to pull money out of the system. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would say that what you're talking about is actually happened in the dialysis sector. You used to have a lot of nonprofit dialysis centers around the country that did exactly that and really looked at this question of how do you treat kidney disease before it becomes kidney failure. But because of failures of governance and blah, 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 DaVita and Fresenius bought up all the nonprofit centers, ran them out of business, and now 75% of dialysis treatments in the country are by these two companies that make billions of dollars. DaVita made about $12 billion last year, and they have been hit by so many prosecutions, but the nonprofits are gone, and the care has suffered.
Well, then they shouldn't be allowed to be for profit. That's all. I mean, it's not all Medicare money, but most of it is Medicare and Medicaid. And the government can just say, no, it would have to be Congress, no private equity, no, all nonprofit, or we won't pay. I've suggested that, and you can imagine how enthusiastically it was received.
Well, some enthusiasm at our end. Who's next?
Hi. In the beginning, you had mentioned Capitol Heights, and I was reading the introduction. Is it District Heights?
Okay. It's District Heights, yeah.
I might be off base on what your book is really based about, because obviously I haven't read it. But does guaranteed income play into the situation, and also single payer healthcare?
Yeah. So guaranteed income would certainly solve a lot of the complexity problems, right? Because right now we have separate programs for housing, nutrition, work tax credits, that kind of thing. And so guaranteed income is very tempting, I think, it would remove a lot of the inefficiencies. It probably would get rid of some of these middlemen that we're talking about. However, the politics are so difficult, I think, around guaranteed income because we have such a hard time as a country talking about just giving cash. You know, we have to condition it in some way, and that's why we have housing vouchers. That's why we have food stamps. That's why we have rules on who is entitled to tax credits, because if you are poor and you want government help, you have to be deserving. And that is something that is kind of rooted in sort of our Puritan roots as a country, that we've always demanded something in exchange for benefits. And I don't think that's going to change. In fact, I think it's going to get worse. We didn't talk about Project 2025 yet, but if any of you have an opportunity to pour through the 900 fascinating pages of Project 2025, work requirements, time limits, it's a much harsher, heartless vision of what the social safety net could look like under, a GOP-led Congress and administration. So does guaranteed income have a future under that scenario? No. Single payer, absolutely not. In fact, Project 2025 argues a lot more for the privatization of Medicaid through managed care organizations. About half the states have managed care organizations running the Medicaid program right now, but what they want to see is all of it. And they also want to see more privatization of Medicare so that everybody's in a Medicare Advantage plan and nobody has traditional fee-for-service. So that is actually part of their agenda as well. So I would agree with you. It would be nice to have conversations about those kinds of things that would really make a difference, but it's probably not possible right now.
Can I just say one thing? Did you say Project 2025?
Yeah, that's the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for what the second term could look like.
Sir?
Yeah, my name is Bradley Anderson. I'm over in Virginia.
Talking to the microphone, Bradley.
All right, do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, my name's Bradley Anderson. I'm over in Virginia, and I was loving the comments. I'm not particularly articulate in this area, so I've come kind of in the role of observer, right? And you had mentioned a handful of programs that didn't work, or maybe that they maybe were somewhat effective at first, and then they became less effective, right? Both with the private and the public sector side, if I was interpreting correctly. I guess my question comes to, I would frame it as, in my mind, it seems like there's a point in time problem where maybe something worked, and then maybe a square peg and round hole problem as well, where we thought that something was a correct fit, but then it turned out not to be. Would you have like a proposal of how you might maybe like reconcile those two problems? And I'm thinking of it maybe in the term of like would it be like more oversight, like as though that's the great patch for all things to fix it, or like are there natural solutions that could be put in with maybe a slight tweaking of something that exists, or maybe even a removal of something?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that. I think it does vary from program to program what those potential tweaks could be, or if a more radical overhaul is necessary. Like a program like Job Corps, I think is what you're referring to, that kind of started out with all this promise and seemed to make sense at the time, and now it makes zero sense.
And maybe it started off with
Right, exactly, with high hopes
some
and that kind of
results, and
thing.
everyone's excited, and then it's
Sure.
like business as usual, and it kind of drifts, right?
Yeah, and what do they call them in Washington? Like zombie programs.
Yeah.
Right. They just like live on and on and on and on. And that's
Well, you talk about in Job Corps, the population that's a little older,
they do okay. Yeah,
they do a little
okay.
better. And then there are some non-Job Corps programs that have even better outcomes, although they tend to cream a little bit. But, if you limited Job Corps to those most likely to be helped, maybe it'd be a little better?
It would
To
be.
answer the gentleman's...
Yeah, that's right. Older students do better in Job Corps, but most, like 80% of the people who are in Job Corps are the younger ones for which there's no effect.
Yeah.
So it would make sense, but it's much harder to recruit the older people. So that's why the Job Corps program doesn't do it.
I see. Please.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Anthony, and I'm a good friend of Anne's. We're in book club together. So it's, we've been walking our dogs and just hanging out with our kids, and have been, it's just been fun to follow your process over the past couple of years. And just was interested in hearing a little bit about some of the challenges with the research. How did you get these organizations to open up and talk to you? Was there anything, any magic to that process? And I'm also curious about kind of the mission motivation. Like if you would often hear these organizations express a philosophy that they felt like they were part of the solution, or that they were being, like they seem, at least they spoke as to the idea that they were trying to, to help.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. They did not, in fact, open up to me. I ended up talking to people who had gone through the system in some way. But like, for example, I wanted to go inside a dialysis center, but they cited privacy and they wouldn't let me in. But there are plenty of people who had survived dialysis who are willing to talk to me about what that experience was like. And so I was able to collect a lot of really horrific stories about basically being treated like a number, like a dialysis factory, like cattle.
The key to making money in the dialysis
Again,
business, I
volume.
learned from Anne's book, is moving the blood quickly through the body, right? And when you do that, it is a punishing thing to go through. And it also puts stress on the heart. So a lot of people drop dead in the chairs. It's brutal stuff.
Yeah, your 5-year survival rate on dialysis is 40%. So that tells you just how punishing this process is. But the benefits, the cool smiles people did, invite me in, and I did check that out. But they didn't know at that time. I didn't know at that time that this is what I wanted to do. Is kind of a revelation that happened while I was there and saw the 5 chairs. Like, I'm not bringing my kids here. Yeah. And then the tax preparers I'd noticed before in the prior jobs, like, there's an awful lot of this. And the pieces kind of fall into place over a bunch of years, that there are an awful lot of industries that seem to make a lot of money. And can I weave a broader narrative around how this is happening in multiple sectors in such a way that our overall national anti-poverty effort really seems to be handicapped by what's going on? And that's kind of what I've tried to do with this book, is try to draw this like big argument. Like, okay, we can complain that the poverty rate hasn't budged since 1977, but instead of either blaming poor people, which is what the GOP tends to do a lot, or conservatives tend to do a lot, or saying we're not spending enough money, which is what happens on the other side, is there something else going on that looks at how these programs are administered, and is it being done in a way that's effective? And that's kind of my process.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Ben. You mentioned private equity firms a few times in your talk. Could you just talk a bit more about their involvement in this industry and I guess what effect that has on outcomes for participants in these programs or of these services?
Yeah, so private equity has, well, they've had a larger footprint in just about everything. I mean, you open up the paper and it's like private equity owns veterinarian services. They own like probably a lot of emergency room departments around the country. They're kind of buying up everything. And they have a pretty large footprint in the kind of the Poverty Inc. space. You know, like I mentioned, they own a lot of the tax prep firms now. They own Medicaid dentistry franchises. They're called dental service organizations. I think it's very, because they're private equity.
Yeah, the Section 8.
Section 8 landlords, right? There's real estate management companies that have portfolios. The low-income housing tax credit, that's also been bought up by private equity firms. They're just looking for any advantage they can get. But because of the private equity piece of it, I'm not sure that we have a handle at this point. And I'm not saying that all private equity is bad. There are many, many firms that are doing good things and making markets more efficient in a lot of areas. But there are some bad actors, and we don't have a regulatory system that is able to keep up with how quickly this market seems to be changing and grabbing a footprint in places where maybe they're not as well suited to providing the kind of services that customers really need, that the low-income Americans in particular really need.
Okay, we've got several people who are waiting, and we only have a few more minutes. So here's what I'd like to do. Would each of you come up and very quickly give a short question, one after another, and we're going to do a lightning round so Anne can answer all the questions.
Okay. Hello, my name is Annie, and I know this was mentioned like very briefly earlier, but I was just kind of wondering how the recent ruling of the Supreme Court on Chevron and kind of this transferring of power from like the executive branch to the more judicial branch kind of affects like everything you discussed in your book.
Great question.
Is there a
Next.
question?
Hi, my name is Dorna. I'm an inspiring dentist. I got waitlisted this past cycle and I'm reapplying. I just wanted to know, in terms of Medicaid and dentistry, and the cost of dentistry, is there like a happy medium where both the patient and the dentist can benefit, since dental school is so costly?
Great question.
Hi, I'm Archana Piatti. I know Anne. Hi, Anne.
Hi. Thanks
I'm
for
a friend of
coming.
Anne's. You mentioned, how polarizing, with the polarizing times we're living in, Republicans talk about, waste and fraud, but focus it on individual actors, whereas Democrats just want to, fund programs, more and more. So is there any kind of advocacy around, like what you're talking about, groups that are saying we need good governance and we need to make sure more of the money of these programs are actually going to the beneficiaries? Is there any kind of... Are there groups or political momentum around your point, your thesis?
Okay, so can you know all the questions? And
I think so.
Okay.
So I did not do well in admin law in law school. So Chevron, actually, I don't need to know it anymore, do I?
Yeah.
Chevron's gone.
Yeah.
Since the agencies have been basically emasculated by the end of Chevron, actually, I think that'll probably make oversight much more difficult, right? Because they have no power. So I think that's the bottom line impact of what's going to happen there. The happy medium on dental school and dentistry, I think there probably can be some incentives that the government could come up with on loan forgiveness and things like that as incentives that are more generous to be able to allow dentists who need to pay back their loans but also want to serve the public good to be able to serve more patients in communities that really need the help. And so I think that's probably the happy medium solution, along with probably more encouragement in dental school that there is a way eventually to be able to do this, and community health centers being expanded to allow this to happen as well. The third piece about momentum, there are organizations, I think, that are trying to fight privatization. So the big one is In the Public Interests. It's kind of an umbrella national organization that's been kind of tracking the impacts of privatization more generally, not just in human services, but also in education with charter schools, for instance. Libraries are becoming privatized. I mean, you'd be surprised what out there is falling into private hands versus public hands. And so I think there is kind of a grassroots citizens movement around that. Around social services in particular, kind of the evaluation of poverty programs in a way has prevented this kind of analysis to happen kind of globally. So, do you want to start one?
Okay, well, we reached the witching hour, Brad. Thank you all for having us. Thank you to Anne. I hope you'll buy the book so that this great organization, Politics and Prose, can prosper. And but there's also free copies of the Washington Monthly where we reviewed Anne's book for as many as we have. They're free for you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, the magazine's up here. Copies of Anne's book are available at the checkout desk. She'll be up here signing. Please form a line to the right of the table. Please fold up your chairs, and let's give Anne another round of applause.